So, hello everyone, and today I'm with my dear friend Jana Norman, a wonderful colleague and friend. And this is the first kind of conversation for the Convexplorations podcast. And Convexploration, as you may or may not realize, is going to be a mixture of conversations, recordings, guided somatic journeys, and all sorts of things, just to have a multi-layered exploration of where we are and what we could become, and contemporary themes, contemporary dilemmas, and visions for how we could have a transformative practice together as human beings, how we could open up to more radically profound, loving, and liberatory ways of being. An important part of this, to my mind, is the importance of returning to a thoroughly body-centered way of being, an embodied set of values, practices, and ethics that really value and learn from our embodied intelligence, our embodied life as highly evolved beings that are not simply human, but also more than human. We're united with all sorts of microscopic and cellular partners that out of which we emerge. And if you listened to the first episode of Convexplorations, you'll have had a very gentle, guided kind of introduction to that kind of thinking. It has a broad name. We could call it new materialism, but we don't have to call it that. We can talk about it in terms of simply returning to what's really here, who we really might be. And I couldn't have a better interlocutor on this than Jana, who's written an amazing book, drawing not only on kind of cellular emergence, but on cosmic identity, on the fact that the minerals of outer space are part of what make us up. And it's a really gorgeous opening. It's a really beautiful imagination that draws on science, draws on Indigenous cosmovisions and other ways of looking, that really expands our sense of who we potentially are, who we really are, and how we step into becomingness, a kind of ongoingness around that. And that's kind of a central theme of what I'd love to chat to Jana about today. So Jana, a really, really warm welcome. It might be great if you kind of just very briefly introduced yourself to people, so know where you're coming from, the context of your thinking, your background, that kind of stuff.
Great. Well, thank you, Anna, and thank you for this invitation. It's really great to be here with you. These conversations are always exciting, stimulating, deeply reflective. So I'm very glad to be here. My background, currently, I should say, is in environmental humanities. So looking at how do we make our ecological relations visible and accountable, so that we're working from within, the idea of relationship, rather than mastery and control, rather than separateness from nature. So that really comes down to what you're talking about, that sense of can we get back into, and when I say we, I'm talking about people who have grown up within and grown up under a way of a worldview, a way of thinking about things where humans are somehow exceptional and set apart from, quote, the rest of nature, when actually we're really a deeply embedded part of nature. And there's something to draw on. Well, there's more than something, there's everything in that, a richness in that to draw on in terms of how we reorient our lives towards justice, towards compassion, towards vulnerability, towards a way of being that has an openness, as you were talking about, to life itself. So anyway, I think and write about that in different contexts, whether that's in thinking about how do we bring that kind of idea into who we are when we're dealing with legal issues, to how are we thinking about that in our everyday lives. So that's
Brilliant.
a
That's
bit of an
beautiful.
overview.
Beautiful. Yeah. So, Jana, would you agree with me that one of the dynamics at work that has led us into a painful political situation, painful social and economic situation in the world at the moment, is this very dynamic of disembedding us from nature, disembodying us from our own creaturely beingness as embodied creatures, And if you would agree, what's your sense of how that came about?
Yeah, I do agree. How it came about is a big question. Uh, there's some sort of epochal historical um, rhythms to it. I've been reading lately about the ancient Native American cities of Turtle Island or North America. This is all kind of really new information, and in those cultures in around the Little Ice Age, what this is a way back thing, and I'm not good with specifics, but it's there was the idea of kind of collecting. Urbanization grew up in these early periods, and somehow that and they literally built there's a they literally built hierarchy. So there are these mound cities in North America um, that are like unto the pyramids, and but made out of earth. And so there were these huge cities, huge for the time, and they ended up breaking down again. And there was a return to a much more egalitarian, smaller social units, more relational framework rather than hierarchical framework. And I just find those kinds of that long arc of history kind of movements, so that then when European explorers entered the frame, they thought they were seeing an underdeveloped culture, which of course they weren't. It was a highly developed civilizations, multiple nations that had been through a cycle of growth towards hierarchy, and seeing that the pitfalls of that, and moving away from it and coming back to an embodied relational framework for their many cultures. And I don't know where we sit in that from a Western cultural standpoint, but you know, there was, if you look at, for example, the biblical texts, there was a push in Hebrew society. There was this push for everyone else has a king, give us a king. And so began the cycle towards a hierarchy, from a dispersed tribal, connected through faith communities. And I'm talking way out of my knowledge zone here, but I know that is part of the story. And are we ready to be flexible with this system that it's clearly not working for the vast majority of people. It's entrenched at this point, right through the classical period, and it seemed like it was moving us forward, but maybe we're more in a circle than a line. And it's time to kind of loop back to rethink, are there other ways of organizing ourselves politically and socially, that are actually fitting for human community and human bodies? That's a
Yeah.
long-winded
No, it's
thing.
great. It's really great, Jana, because it seems that the way you framed that is a kind of tidal nature to the
Mhm.
process. And it does feel to me, at least, that at the moment we're at a critical kind of inflection point or bifurcation point, um,
Mhm.
precisely between those two dynamics. One is homogenizing, right? It's saying
Uh,
it's going back to kind of we want control over and a particular identifiable group will be at the top of that pyramid,
mhm.
and we do not wish for the kind of
Mhm.
diversity that threatens that homogeny. And then
Mhm.
there's another tide, which is the movement towards, well, we need to be inclusive, we need to be diverse, we need more dispersed modes of governance. You know, I'm thinking here of things like the commons-based
Mhm.
opportunities and alternatives that are out there that are not in the mainstream, that they don't hit the
Mhm.
mainstream media, but they're everywhere, and they're ancient human modes of organizing relationships with place. There's something very situated about those. There's something very local about those. Um, but they can, of course, flourish in conversation with each other. And I'm
Mhm.
just sort of returning in my thinking to what you said at the beginning about ecological kind of knowing. I can't remember how you phrased it,
Mhm.
but it seems to me that
Mhm.
natural patterns themselves reveal both the in-breath and the out-breath of this. But
Mhm.
more importantly, to be ecologically responsible, we know that monocropping and mono emphatic kind of modes of everything being the same, whether it's a crop or an animal or an ecosystem, when they lose diversity, when they lose
Mhm.
their natural wildish capacity for mixing, when they lose that capacity for internal tensions, which are important to thriving, as well as
Mhm.
some notion of harmony, because often when people talk about ecological thinking, they're thinking in terms of like harmonious relations where nature itself becomes romanticized and essentialized. And that's not how it is right on the ground. There are convergences, collaborations, cooperations, tensions, and competitions. And all this forms a kind of generative energy whereby things thrive. They become, mutually engaged, relational, and they already are relational, but we have to open up to see that. And so maybe the answer here lies precisely in re-embedding ourselves, in
Mhm.
understanding that we are, as you said at the beginning, we are nature. And actually, we're not
Mhm.
just one thing, we're a multiplicity of things. Not only
Mhm.
physiologically are we a multiplicity of things that are porous to a multiplicitous world, not only is it
Mhm.
the true that my mitochondria respond to sunlight far below the awareness of the brain that people imagine is the CEO, all that, but
Mhm.
we're multiplicitous also as beings in terms of our psychological self. And I think this is where
Mhm.
it gets interesting in relation to spirituality, because there's a real risk for humans, I feel, whereby we get addicted to our own thinking. We get addicted to mind patterning. And we
Mhm.
take what the mind believes about reality to be reality, rather than coming
Mhm.
from this place of an embodied, spacious awareness that notices those patternings and
Yeah.
notices the emotional expansion, contraction, clenching, or grabbing that happens in response to those reality tunnels. And it seems to me at the
Yeah.
moment that in our culture, what we're looking at is people being pushed into very different kinds of reality tunnels that
Mhm.
increasingly speak past each other, when in fact,
Mhm.
I think what's called for is a relational encounter with
Mhm.
others that comes from a much more grounded, expansive sense of being and the ability to be comfortable with discomfort, to stay in the vibrant spaces of tension that nature itself shows us is fundamental to evolutionary growth and becoming. So I'd love to know your response to that thought.
Yes, well, as you were talking about it and going back to some of the beginnings of that part of the conversation, I was thinking about, and it speaks to that re-embedding ourselves, and what does that look like, and then what does it look like in contrast to some of the other things? But I'll think about that in a second. But I was thinking of. I've got a friend who's thinking of coming here to Australia for a period of time from Scotland, where she's been working with seagrass and oyster restoration projects. And she was talking about even within the projects that she works with in Scotland, they were borrowing a model from Wales and hoping to embed that model in some of the projects in Scotland, and they didn't work. Things are, and so it's that playing with one of the cycles or the patterns or the ebbs and the flows, is that having that relation, being open to the both and of highly local and highly interconnected across the broadest, not scale, but the most distant connections. So that led me to think about this seagrass idea, which is restoring seagrass is literally an act of embedding. You create seagrass beds by embedding grasses in denuded undersea spaces. And it made me think, and then you were talking about kind of getting out of our own heads, and can we be in a place where we are observing these types of patterns, whether we are marine conservationists or not. That's her job to notice those things, but we can come up close to them when we're not those experts. And it made me then kind of jump to that, can we open ourselves to seeing what is actually there, seeing how nature works? And so then I started thinking about things in the Christian tradition, like consider the lilies of the field. A sower went out to sow and spread some of the seed on, and that can we develop and participate in what nature is offering as stories for being. So I'm thinking about, so you take that seagrass and you think about embeddedness, you think about localization, you think about seagrass is everywhere, and you think about its participation in the bigger ecosystems. It's such a enormous part of ocean ecosystems, marine ecosystems. And you get, so which is tapping into that relational encounter with others. Yeah, so those are some of the places where what you were talking about led me. And being comfortable with the discomfort. There is a discomfort in learning how to learn, or in observing and stopping to observe, stopping to take in what's happening, whether it's with seagrass or with one's own community or with one's own body. So taking that practice of observing, not to mimic or to create metaphor out of what's happening, to go back to those parables from the New Testament and Christianity. Parables aren't metaphors. They're metaphoric. They materialize spiritual being rather than spiritual concepts. And if you live like the lilies of the field, what are the results of that? If you be a human like a lily, which sounds like a metaphor, but yeah.
That's really
Those are
interesting.
some of the places where what we're talking about has taken me.
I love that. But I also think metaphors are metaphors in the sense that, I'm thinking here of that wonderful book by, is it Johnson and Lakoff, Philosophy in the Flesh? And they take on Western disembodied mind-body split type philosophy of, Descartes, Kant. They take that on, that whole Western rationalist tradition, which of course is a huge part of how we've ended up where we are. It's part of, it's part of what Western thinking has brought to this cycle that you were talking about, right? And has been huge and remains huge. The body-mind split remains huge. But in that book, Johnson and Lakoff argue that second-generation cognitive science shows that our thinking is deeply structured by metaphor, and that metaphor is unconscious and embodied, so that more is up, for example. So that embedded in our very way of negotiating the world is the body, the embodied nature of how we experience what we experience and how we translate that into language and how we then translate that into concepts. And it's really,
that
really
makes
interesting.
sense.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because when I work with like hypnosis, when I work with clients, for example, one of the things I'm interested in is listening very closely to the metaphorical structures they use when they're talking about things, because I have to take those metaphors very literally. It's startling to me sometimes how literal the metaphorical really is, how it is mattered into it's the materiality, lived patterns of their lives and realities, and how when you work with, for example, moving a relationship through space, it changes the feeling in the body in a way that can change the psychological relation. So, for example, someone is struggling in a relationship with, say, their father, and you get them to close their eyes and tell you where their father is, the father might be right here. And when you start saying, okay, move him around in your imagined space, the feeling, the relationship changes. So I love this idea of the metaphor, the sense in which the metaphorical, the imaginary, is in some sense always materializing, in some sense always resonating in an embodied, lived way. And it's a trick, isn't it, of the Western mind to pretend that the visual itself, the imagined visual, and we know it's a dominant sense, of course, is the end of the story. I'm kind of taking it back. I kind of think of Francis Bacon here for some reason, the idea of looking at the world through a microscope or a telescope in order to control it. There's a kind of metaphor there to how the Western mind has constructed reality and closed out multiplicitous different ways of experiencing and being. And there's something invitational here about returning to that comfort with discomfort, part of which is I'm not a monolith. I'm not a monolith. And mind is not a monolith. One moment my mind can say, hey, you really deserve that piece of chocolate cake. And this is a very puerile example. I eat the cake and then mind will say, you're such a fatso. Why are you always eating cake? I mean, that thing is inherently unreliable, right? And yet we believe the personal mind, the swirling and eddying of that archaeology that we think we are. Whereas in fact, when we drop back into that awareness, as you said, that observational, that witnessing, that awareness that we're the awareness of awareness itself that watches that patterning, that sees its unreliability. And I'm not anti-mind. I mean, like you, I've worked as an academic, I'm not against the intellect. I celebrate the intellect, not as a closure, but as a tool, as a gift, as a capacity that we have as human beings, as part of our material becoming. But the personal mind, the thing that constantly chatters, that eddies and moves around and tells me stories, whether those stories are collective stories that I inherit unconsciously from everything around me, or whether those are my personal stories about what I think I am, how I think I became what I became. I think we have to be able to be spacious enough to step back from that, and to allow the discomfort of not knowing. Because actually in that not knowing, there's incredible openness. Epistemically, we become open to ideas that might be uncomfortable and unfamiliar, that might threaten some sense of self that's built on this narrower foundation of who I think I am, what my stories are. Yes, that if I identify with that, it's going to be frightening to me to have it challenged. If I identify, for example, I'm a white woman, I've come from a privileged background insofar as I've been educated to a high level, that has given me choicefulness, agency that I might not have otherwise had. It's a particular mode of privilege. If I identify my worth with that, my soul value with that, and I crystallize around that identity, I clench around it, and then I become defensive, if it's critiqued or attacked or invited to encounter otherness, I could become very uncomfortable, right? And there's a moment for all of us sometimes when we encounter some difference or someone who's very different or an idea that feels very threatening, that we get this fearing, clenching, and it can become a cultural pattern. It can become a political norm. And I would argue that all the lefting and righting and tribalisms of the moment, in a sense, are that writ large. And I feel there's a real invitation here to return to this embeddedness in our own capacity for complexity, our own capacity to know ourselves as multi-layered, and our own sense of how nature itself exhibits these tensions, convergences, and diversities that seem to be key to our becoming. And even as a self, as someone who's spent, I don't know how many years in psychotherapy and spiritual practice. I mean, I had my first mystical experience when I was 6. I spent a lot of time in spirituality and spiritual practice. To me, that's a journey of constantly letting go, constantly surrendering, right? Constantly allowing, embracing, expanding, to be more and more comfortable with all sorts of forms of discomfort, to find the equanimity in which those things can arise and pass, do the dance that you spoke about so beautifully in the circularity of hierarchy and, diversification. Something similar goes on, I think, in the self.
Yeah, well, I absolutely. And that willingness to experiment, and um, to recognize when you're out of sorts. Like there's discomfort and then there's discomfort. There's the discomfort of rigidity, and then there's the discomfort of openness or letting go of that rigidity. And when I think about what it would have taken for, say, in the example I was talking about before, for a population, a culture to say, this isn't working and we need to go back to some other principles, and the principles that we want to return to are a form of relationship that allows everyone to flourish, and that allows the environment that we depend on to flourish. We need to return to that and go through all of the grief like it was a spectacular culture. And so in their bodies, they would be holding the grief of that no longer working and reaching its endpoint. The courage to step away from that, the courage to remember other kinds of skills and other ways of knowing. It must have been powerful times. Within it, like within the discomfort, within the vulnerability, there is that re-engaging powerful sense of agency. I don't like this. This doesn't feel good. I am not flourishing here. I'm sitting with that. What does matter to me? What do I want? And the I in the sense of what do I want for myself and others? What do I, that sort of expanded I of what do I want for this world with me in it? Wherever you're coming from in terms of how you articulate that expanded sense of self that includes others, and then what becomes that sense of recuperation, where you're recuperating an agency that you had given over to that identity, that over-identification. It isn't too long before the discomfort is replaced by that restored or that sense of recuperating an agency.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's really true. And I think it's true in terms of all sorts of movements through our embodied lives, both as collectives and individuals. And I love the idea of the expanded I, because the reality is we're never hermetically sealed. We're not. We're porous. Even our skin is a porous meeting point. Okay, we can think of it as a boundary, but a boundary is often a meeting point, and it's, the skin is a meeting point between light and the what we think of as the interior and exterior of the body. And there's something here as well about this invitation to recuperate and expand. Inevitably, I suspect there'll come a new point at which you hit the limits. There'll be some limits, some new need to expand, a new form of discomfort that emerges that invites this. Are you going to contract here, or are you going to expand here? Are you going to loosen off and allow and let go, intelligently, grounded and ethically thoughtful, engaged, committed to certain values that are inclusive and loving? Or are you going to contract? And that contraction, a particular kind of contraction, because we have the inflow and the outflow, of course, but there's a particular kind of contraction which is tight, which is defensive, which is brittle, so that it meets vulnerability with fear, which turns into anger. And we hear so much of that now. And I guess those of us who've spent time wrestling with this can feel the fear, the sense of threat, the fragility under the rage. And to me, that draws out my compassion, even as I feel anger is a totally inappropriate response, particularly when that anger goes out to other and reject and reduce other humans or other living systems. There's something there, isn't there, about the invitation of the moment. And it comes back to this sense, Jana, of being in this inflection point between two modes of being in the, two main modes of being in the world. There's so much more going on than that. But there is this choice, who do we want to be? How do we want to relate? How do we want to live? Because I actually believe that the vast majority of human beings flourish best in communities where they feel accepted, seen and heard and loved, valued, allowed to pursue their conceptions of the good, what makes them joyful, what makes them happy, etc. I truly believe that most humans do not flourish in systems where one notion of the good controls everybody else's choices. And I feel that's part of the inflection point that we're at. And there's something really invitational here about returning to embeddedness, returning to embodiment, returning to relationality, understanding with a true sense of ecological understanding, with the necessary tension and vibrancy, who it is that we're being invited to be in this particular historical and planetary moment.
Yeah, that's right. And letting yourself, I liked when you said loosening off, because it's that to me, that's the heart of the invitation. And it means that you don't have to go any of the next steps past that. It's just whenever there's that sense of constriction, noticing it and saying, just how can I loosen that? How can I loosen that? And loose does not mean you're giving away the shop. It doesn't mean you've lost your sense of values. It doesn't mean it's not disintegrating. Loosening is just giving open space to something, to see what's there. I really appreciate that very particular word, because the fear arises in the sense of, do I have to let go of everything that makes sense to me? And I need some structure, I need some form, I need these boundaries, I need to know where but the invitation around loosening allows for the bit of flexibility, that bit of inflow you've talked about, the in and out. And I think it's a really good spot to finish on, in the sense, because it's if we can name what the invitation is at this inflection in multiple ways, the next conversation we have will name it differently, and I look forward to that. But I like sitting with the invitation to just loosen.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. And it's a great spot to end the conversation. Loosening and allowing, and also just
Mm-hmm.
grounding in something deeper than our fears.
Mm-hmm.
Experientially, most of us, I think, could probably access that deeper sense that is aware of what we're going through, unless we're really caught up in it. But even in very extreme states, we can have what Rachel on Friends called floating Rachel. There's that aspect of self that's aware of what we're going through. And if we can come
Mm-hmm.
from there and relax into that as we loosen and allow, we don't have to get lost in the loosening. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to threaten us. It becomes a place where we can rest. It's very invitational. And I really look forward to our next conversation too, Jana. So thank you very much indeed for being with me.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. I look forward to it as well.
Me too.